Perfect. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute as people filter in from the waiting room.
For those who are coming in, please put in the chat where you're calling in from and also what brought you here today.
All right, there we are. Okay. All right. Well, we will get started. Let me share my screen. Welcome, everyone, this evening. We're really happy to have you here. I'm going to be doing something fun and share my screen in a very different way from how I normally do. But welcome, everyone, to our letter to the editor training this evening. This is the first letter to the editor training we've actually done in a little while. So we're really excited to have you here and be joined by some awesome experts on this topic. So before we get into the content, I do want to make sure that everyone's aware of our translation instructions. So we are interpreting this webinar in Spanish this evening. And so if you would like to listen to the Spanish interpretation, click on that little globe at the bottom of your screen. So hace clic en enlace de interpretación and then select Spanish. So seleccione español, and you will go into the translation room. So we'll put reminders for that in the chat throughout the evening, so you are able to hop in there. We will also be sending the recording out in both Spanish and English. So if you have to hop off, you'll get that in either language. So, and then for logistics, so if we welcome questions, we want to hear from you. We want your questions. So type your questions in the Q&A box, if at all possible. We do have a smaller audience tonight, so we might be able to unmute people as they have questions later. But a good way to get started is to type in the Q&A. So you can also view that by going to that little more button or the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then if you want to talk to others, feel free to use the webinar chat. Make sure that if you do want to talk to fellow attendees, that you select everyone in that two panel instead of hosts and panelists, because otherwise you'll just be talking to us, and as fun as that is, you probably want to talk to everybody else. So make sure that you have that selected. And again, use the Q&A for questions. All right, so our agenda this evening, we are going to be going through introductions, so that'll happen in just a second. We'll talk briefly about our theory of change, and then we'll be doing an overview of letters to the editor, including the importance, the process, and consideration, and that'll be sort of a little bit bigger overview, and then we have our wonderful panelists who will dive into idea generation and strategies for success, so diving in a little bit deeper into the best ways to get started. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and takeaways. All right. So introductions. First, my name is Annie Wolf. I am our VP of Community Impact here at Solar United Neighbors. I've been here for a little over 4.5 years, and I'm based in Salem, Massachusetts, so up here in New England. And fun fact about me is not letter to the editor related, but I am a scuba diver. So I spend a lot of time underwater with my husband, diving all over the place as much as we possibly can. So Michelle, I'll hand it over to you. Oh, Michelle, you're muted.
Oh, thanks, Annie. Yeah, so thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Kowach, and I am the Community Impact Fellow here at Solar United Neighbors. Really happy to have you all here today and talk to you about letter to the editor writing. And a fun fact about myself, I would have to say, while I'm not a scuba diver yet, I do have 2 adopted corals that are safely in their natural habitat, and I will visit them someday. Right, I will pass it over to you, Chris, Chris and Helen will be our wonderful panelists later on.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm Chris Wiegard. I'm the Virginia State Co-Coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby. I write a lot of letters to the editor, and it's great fun. And I hope to share the fun with others. Helen.
Hi everyone, I am Helen. I'm from Ohio, but I am currently At the College of William and Mary for my junior year. I am a geology and conservation major. And a fun fact about me is this summer I've gotten really into paleontology, and I've been working with Ice Age mammals to help with conservation work in Alaska area.
That is a very fun fact, for sure. That's very cool. Well, and we're really excited to have both Chris and Helen here to share their experiences firsthand of writing and submitting letters to the editor. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Sun or want a reminder, I just want to go through our theory of change, sort of how we approach the work that we do. So, Solar United Neighbors was founded a little over a decade ago, and our idea is that the going solar is really just the first step in your journey as a solar supporter. So, we help people go solar, join together, and fight for our energy rights. So, going solar hopefully exposes you to the wonderful world of being a solar owner and how it can have a positive impact on lots of different aspects of your own personal life as well as your community. We want to make sure that solar is as accessible as possible to others in your community as well. So ideally, the next step is to take things and advocate for them, just like writing letters to the editor or attending a lobby day or just showing your support for solar by telling your solar story. All right, and then I will pass it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Annie. So before we begin, we want to make sure that we all get on the same page and cover what is a letter to the editor. So a letter to the editor, which you will often hear us call an LTE, is a short letter sent to a publication, and it's often a response to something that you've read, and it's about issues of concerns for readers. And these letters might be a number of things, and we outlined 4 of those here. One of the options is it's praising, right? You could absolutely agree with everything that they have said, and you really want to reinforce this and say, hey, you're covering content on the right topics, and we agree with it. We want to see more of it. Keep it up. It could be bolstering. Perhaps you do agree with them, but perhaps you feel like they need to add information on certain aspect and you want to enhance what they're saying. Perhaps it's something where you agree with what they're saying, but you feel like they forgot an important angle that's really important that other people know about when they're thinking about this issue. It could be you don't agree with anything they said and you think your community needs to know about it, and you're going to help share some information and maybe get into a discussion on it. And we like to say a combination of these two because, oftentimes it really is, at least a couple of these. You'll hear later from Chris and Helen on perhaps on some of like what they have written. But it's really a powerful tool to convey information, thoughts, feelings that you feel is really important to encourage conversation on. All right, so we have now gotten a kind of level set on what a letter to the editor is. Annie will take us to the next slide, and we're going to go into why are LTEs important? Well, to sum it up, they are a meaningful and easy way for citizens to advocate for public policy, right? A letter to the editor, especially if you get it published, it's something that it lives on. It is out there in the world, oftentimes with newspapers online too. You can see, people can access it. They can see that impact. It's a very public facing way for different people to see what kind of thoughts are out there. And it's something that, like we said, letter to the editors are pretty short. It's something you can do that is impactful in a number of ways over a lunch break. And, maybe 2 lunch breaks if you like to be super thorough like me. All right, we'll go to the next one. Diving more into why they're important, we want to look at what exactly is it that they can do. And we would say that informing and persuading are key components of an LTE. And this is not just to the readers whom you might expect, right? The people reading it. This is also to the newspaper editors. They are making decisions about what should be published, what they think needs to be focused on. And when they see letters that are coming in about these topics, that indicates to them not only is there interest from our readers, they are taking action, putting in the time to actually write to us. And that says a lot with your action, right? They know that you really mean it. And in a similar vein too, but something that people don't always necessarily know is that representatives and policymakers, their staff monitor the LTE sections. So if you mention your congressperson or representative, their staff will let them know. And that is really powerful for decision-making processes and policy. And increasing community awareness. That's another thing, right? Not only in all these decision makers informing and persuading, but bringing attention to these issues. And our world has expanded the way in which we share things. There's social media, there's newspapers, there's some people still get physical copies of newspapers. And the thing that is really important about LTEs, right, is perhaps somebody does see it, they get their news in one way. If they see it again in another way, it really enhances it. Or perhaps a certain age group or a certain person really likes to see their news only in one way. And so we'll talk a little bit later too about being able to kind of, use both of those. But the more we can get conversations out in different forms, the more beneficial it is for different people and larger audiences as well. And building on that, engaging people in public discourse, right? People talk about what they read. These become conversation topics. They inspire people to think deeper. They make people, reflect on things they hadn't thought before. That's a really powerful thing that LTEs can do. And the last thing that we want to highlight is they do encourage more attention on issues, even if they are not published. Volume does matter. Because again, when you're submitting those letters, that indicates to the editors what their readers care about. And you might see more content on those topics that you're submitting on. So volume does matter. And even if it's not published, that is making a difference. So we really want to emphasize that, because oftentimes you can feel like if it wasn't accepted, that you're like, oh, like I'm not seeing what happened, but it's there, it's making a difference. And it's Chris and Helen will talk more about that later too, but it's something we want to hammer and hope, like every letter counts. All right, next slide. Okay, so we know what an LTE is, we know why it's important. Now decided to write one. Before you begin, it's always good to check your LTE submission guidelines. Want to just make sure that they do actually accept them before you put in the effort of writing something for a specific thing. So you can check your newspaper's website. And we have just a screenshot here of a local Ohio newspaper. You can see that, they do accept LTEs, and they do specify that they expect exclusivity. So that's something that we want to highlight as well, is that if you're submitting letters to the editors, you want to make sure that that one letter you've heard back from that newspaper before you start sending it out willy-nilly, because that just complicates things quite a bit if papers do expect exclusivity and you would have to backtrack and recommunicate that, oh, I have to retract this or whatnot. So save yourself the hassle, submit to one at a time. All right, so you have located your submission guidelines. There are a few things that you want to look at and confirm. It confirmed that they accept LTEs. You now want to check the word count. And that's generally 150 to 250 words. So I told you they're pretty short, and we definitely meant it. A few do allow you to go much longer, but generally, like it's kind of within that range. And you also want to confirm how they want you to submit their letter. Is there a submission form? Perhaps you email it in. Just a few logistics for you to know ahead of time. The other things that you do want to consider are timing, locality, and frequency. All right, so timing, if you are writing a letter in response to an article that you read 2 years ago, unless there's something that happened and there's a big, update, chances are the newspaper is not going to think that's news. They're not going to want to publish that, right? We want it to be timely. We want it to be relevant. That's what the newspapers want to focus on. And different publications, different areas, they have different things that they want. So it's like perhaps one area, it's a very big newspaper and it's better if you can respond to it in a day, 2 days. Some might have a little bit more leeway, but that's definitely something you want to consider if publication is what you're going for. Locality is also something to consider. Perhaps it's your local newspaper. It's really important that they know that you're a resident and that affects you. And they're happy to have somebody who lives in their community share thoughts on that. It's not to say that you can't submit something to where you live, but it's something to consider in terms of your approach overall. And frequency is the other thing. If you have gotten several letters to the editor published, or maybe you just got one published last month, they might have a lower chance of wanting to publish your letter in the same newspaper that next month, for instance, because they might want to share the opportunity for as many voices as possible. Again, it's not to say that that won't happen or that it can't, but if publication is your end goal, these are all just good things to think about. And again, at the end of the day, as long as you have submitted a letter to the editor, that still helps. But for thinking about getting it published, those are all very helpful. All right, next slide. And Annie is going to take us into what those steps look like of writing an LT.
There we go. I promise it's not a 50-step recipe in order to get an LTE written and hopefully published. But here are a few things to keep in mind as you are getting started. So you want to be clear. You want to introduce your topic and the importance of your topic and show appreciation when possible. So thanking your local representative or those in your community who are working on this issue. Really important to express that appreciation if that's relevant to your letter. You also want to connect and stay focused. If it's a topic or it's an issue that you can relate to a personal story, that's even better. We can all think of many, many times where you've heard a story, you've heard a reason why something matters to someone and it connects to their own lives and it makes a difference. It makes you sit up and pay attention a little bit more than you would otherwise. However, at the same time, if there are facts and statistics to support your position, you definitely want to use those. You'll see in a couple of the examples in a minute, people will start off by telling why they're connected to an issue, and then they'll go into this is, the number of jobs saved, or this is the number of kilowatt hours my system produces, if you're talking about a rooftop solar installation. So connecting to those facts and figures is definitely important as well. And you want to specify how your topic affects you and others. Why should someone care? Why should someone change their position? Why should someone support this bill or support this policy or make sure that your community is protected for X, Y, or Z reason? So why it affects you, but also why it affects those around you within your community. And step 3, you want to close with an ask. So be solution oriented with your response. We all have either read a letter or we can think in our minds of that person who is always coming with problems and no solutions. Sometimes there's not going to be a clear solution. Sometimes there's multiple solutions to a problem. And sometimes it truly is just to get the word out there. But even if the ask is to share this story, share this policy with your friends and family, if you're reading this, that's an ask. And that's really important to make something concrete. We all we all can feel really, sort of paralyzed by not knowing what to do next. So it's really helpful if you provide those steps. You can also share a resource for them to learn more. If this is something in print, then you won't necessarily want to share a link to a website or something like that, but direct people to where they can learn more and where they can get an additional background on the issue. Since a lot of the time you will not have a ton of words in order to be able to explain. You don't have a ton of a big word count. And then again, give people actions they can take. So is that coming out to support an event? Is that writing their own letter? Is that calling their representative? What can they do in order to take this next step? And I see a couple of raised hands, but we will get to questions at the end, I promise. So a couple of samples of letters to the editor that have actually been published. So this one was submitted back in 2021 to the Indiana Business Journal. And this was in reference to an article. So it was an article that was published in the journal on May 21st. And this letter in response was published in early June. So when you heard Michelle talking about timing, this is a great example of making sure that a letter gets posted, a letter gets submitted pretty soon after an article is published. So they were referencing specifically an article that was published in the paper. And this person, Doug, also talked about why this story was personal to him. So he was talking about how he put solar panels on his roof and what the policy is that he's in support of. And this is unfortunately, Indiana's been in a net metering fight and no longer does net metering, but he's showing support for this policy for selling his electricity back to the grid. So not only do we get a benefit through cost reduction, but we also benefit all other consumers by supplying excess energy back to the grid. So not only does this policy support him and his family, but this is how it supports his community. And then he closes with an ask. If net metering goes away, many solar owners would buy battery storage and hoard energy for their own use and not share back to the grid. So he's asking for his representatives and his fellow community members to support solar. And then an example in El Nuevo Dia, which is a paper in Puerto Rico. So this is also, ironically, about net metering, because unfortunately, Puerto Rico is also going through a net metering fight right now. But this was a more recent article, so one that got published back in January of this year. And so this follows the same structure. So at the beginning of the letter, Victor is talking about how he went solar in a co-op in 2020, and himself and his neighbors decided to do so. And he's talking about how it changed their life, that they're producing energy for their community, that it's helping with their resiliency, and that it's a critical piece of ensuring that the energy system is supported in Puerto Rico. This one actually had a little bit longer of a word count, so you can read the rest of it online. He was allowed to write a little bit more than Doug was in the Indiana letter. And then a few things to keep in mind. Was this you, Michelle?
I mean, if you want to keep going, you can.
No, go for it.
Sounds good. Yeah. So to kind of add and sum up this, there are a few things that you always want to do. And the first and foremost thing that we actually do ask is always be respectful, because being rude or harsh or criticizing in a very negative way, right? That probably isn't the best approach to getting anything solved, making anyone feel good, and making them feel open, right? So we always, even if you don't agree with something, there's a way to disagree respectfully. And so that's the first thing to always keep in mind is let's keep things civil, polite, kind. We can definitely always do that. The other thing that we always want you guys to do is to ask people to take a specific action, right? It's that solution-oriented component. We want to do more than just say, hey, like, this is something that needs to be solved, or, hey, like, wouldn't it be great if we did this? We've all been there where we read something, we think it's really cool, and then we're like, oh, how can we help? How can we make a difference? So it's really helpful for you to kind of, especially if you have been thinking about this and you know how people can get involved or help make that difference, to take that barrier down, right? Share what others can do and make it something that people are excited to, they're like, oh, I can do that, right? Connect those dots. All right. When you can, it's really helpful to relate your letter to a recent article published in the paper, right? Especially if you want to get it published. This is especially helpful if you do it at the beginning so they know exactly what it was in relation to, and you're definitely going to have a higher success rate, right? Like the letters to the editors, they're in response. And so when you can be specific and say, hey, this is what made me want to respond to you guys, that's really helpful. With things that we say avoid always, do not repeat false information. All right. Even if it's you're saying this is what this thing said was false, right? If someone's skimming an article or they're glancing through and they don't see that not portion, even though you said not, if you repeated that false information, they might accidentally just catch that part, or they might internalize that and start saying, oh, well, maybe, there's something to that. We want to just avoid that. So if there is false information, the best thing to do is to talk about the correct information. The other thing that we say that you should avoid is adding website links. And the reason for that is that for people, they can't always click on those links when they're reading, depending on how they're reading. And not all the publications like that. And so if you can just avoid putting links in, but instead saying, hey, this organization has a great website to check out, and directing them more in that way, that is just kind of a best practice sort of thing. And the other thing to avoid is jargon. Any jargon, technical terms, we don't want to make these letters intimidating, confusing to anyone. We just always want you to assume that the readers are unaware of the things that you are writing about, or that, they're very kind of, we want to make sure we're starting on like a level playing field. So people who are getting into that topic don't just leave with a bunch of questions. We want them to be able to understand that letter immediately and be inspired and be like, that makes total sense. I understand that. That relates to my life. I want to do something. So we don't want to alienate anyone. No jargon, no technical terms. And so those are the things that we want you to keep in mind as you're writing your letters to the editors. So you have written your letter. The thing we want you to do next is ask a friend, email a friend, family member, someone you volunteer with, or even one of us at Sun. It's always good to have somebody, a second set of eyes to go over it. Somebody to say, hey, look, you forgot this punctuation, or perhaps they catch something that you thought was really clear, but you wrote it at 2 a.m. and didn't have coffee, and they're like, all right, like, this is not saying what you think it's saying. So it's always good to get that extra set of eyes, and just a different opinion. Make sure it's coming across the way that you want it to. Our team is happy to provide feedback on your draft, and our email is getinvolved@solarunitedneighbors.org. You can find this email on our website as well, and we'll also put it in the chat. But if you do want to ask us, our team is more than happy to look at your letter to the editor. The one thing that we want you to make sure you do is when you are asking anyone for feedback on your letter, not only should you give them a date to respond, you should give them a time to respond, because it just helps keep communication clear. You're not itching to respond where you're like, oh, I needed to submit this at 4, and then Helen, sends me her feedback at 5, and I'm like, oh, Helen put all this time into it and I already submitted it, right? We want to avoid that when possible. So ask a friend, give them a date, and give them a time. Right? And then you're ready to submit. Your form might look a little something like this. It might look very different, but this is just one example that we wanted to share with you so you could see what that might look like and some of the information that you might need to provide. You can see on this submission form, they ask for your full name, your email, and they do ask for a little bit of information. So you can see their phone number and address. Now, don't be scared. The reason why they do ask for this is because they need to verify that you wrote the letter. So you might get a phone call from the newspaper and they're like, hey, we want to publish your letter, but we just want to make sure that you wrote it. And that is the reason why. They're not going to publish your personal information, especially like something as identifiable as your address. You will know what they are going to publish. All right. And then we have another example of what a submission page might look like. For this example, they just have a block of text with your instructions there. So again, it's just know that sometimes the forms are different. You might have that specific submission form, you might have text, you might have slightly different instructions, slightly different information, but you'll always be able to find that on their website. And then, yeah, after submission, again, the paper might call you to confirm your identity. But if you haven't heard back, give them a call. Perhaps that's enough to, put it on their radar and get it published. Sometimes that can help. But maybe you haven't heard back and you don't feel, calling is not quite your jam, and that's okay. And maybe they decide not to publish it. Again, that's still an impact you made. We still want to know. If you get published, we definitely want to know, because then you can send us the link and we might be able to share that on our social media as well and amplify your message. And so if you do get your article published, put it at the get involved at solarunitedneighbors.org, and we'd be delighted to take a look and share that. And then the last thing was sharing social media, and Helen, we'll have Helen talk a little bit more about that. But again, cross platforms is really nice. And so now we are going to open it up to our panelist session. So we'll have Chris and Helen talking about idea generation and strategies for success, as well as sharing information on their experiences. Chris has written over and published over 50 LTEs. So say that he is a prolific LTE writer seems like an understatement. And then Helen just got her first LTE published this past summer. And they both have such wonderful different experiences and thoughts that they'll be able to share with you guys. So we have a few questions and different things that they'll be sharing. And then again, we do have time at the end for any additional questions you have for both the panelists and Annie and myself at the end. All right, so first off, Chris and Helen, we do have a few questions, but is there anything that you guys just want to add and enhance in the presentation that we just gave? Oh,
You're
Chris?
muted, Chris.
Sorry, I had a thunderstorm, so I was trying to mute. I loved your presentation. I have a quotation that I like to use that sort of amplifies what you were talking about with staying civil, Michelle. Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That's how you should visualize what you're trying to do. Even if you're disputing something, you have to do it in a very civil way, because you're not talking to the person you're disputing with. You're actually talking to the middle of the road readers who will be turned off if they think you're rude.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. I love it.
I had a note as well. Also, shorter is sometimes better. Like if it says the word count is 400, you don't have to hit that 400. It can be a little lower. And then also something else that was kind of on like the don't section is to like try and stay on topic. So it's wanting to pull people in who might not otherwise be exposed to this. And so don't talk about other political hot topics, like don't mention abortion or gun laws or along those lines, unless, for instance, like if it is relevant to your LTE. I know I do see how immigration and climate change are connected, so you can tie things in along those lines as well. And then also another thing you can do is, if you don't want to write an LTE, my journalist friend informed me that you can simply just call the newspaper as well and just say, "Hey, I want to see," especially local papers, like this is something I want to see more about. Um, get solar and climate.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen and Chris. Yeah, no, those are all really great. And I guess so I love that you said to stay on topic, but I guess going into that, right? So you've decided to write an LTE, you've located your guidelines, and you want to do it, but now you're like, okay, how do I go about this? The first question is, how do you pick where do you begin picking a topic in writing your letter to the editor? And then Chris, I know perhaps we'll have you start with that one, given that you have gone through this process so many times.
Well, generally, Michelle, I start out by prospecting. So I'll go to the newspaper itself, usually online, and I'll poke around and do some searching in their search box and see what articles and editorials they have published very recently. And often when I read that, assuming I can sneak through the paywall and read it, then I will have something to respond to. It usually, when you find something that's on your general topic, it's pretty easy to say, "Oh, they left out something. There's my hook. I'm going to say what they left out." Or I really disagreed with their point about net metering being unnecessary. That was bad, and I need to explain why they were wrong. Or, you're reading it critically, you're probably going to come up with something that you want to say. But in the newspaper business, they are very flattered when you refer to their work. It's an endorsement, right? It's telling other people, "Hey, this was really thought-provoking. This was really important. You should be reading this newspaper." So it's a great starting point.
Wonderful, thank you. I guess then I'll have another question, and I'll let either one of you add to this or respond to this. What if you feel like you have nothing to say? You're like, I really don't know where to begin. Like, I've looked at all these newspapers, but like, what do I have to say that someone else couldn't? What are your thoughts on that?
I can go. So I think one, it depends. You do not have to respond to every article you see. I like to go to the Google News tab. Like I type in climate change, go to the Google News tab, and then I can like filter by different papers that have like the date, so I can see the latest one and just pick a paper that I want to respond to. So go till you find something that really calls out to you. And also, get if you do run into writer's block, just try to write down a few sentences, go to what you normally your normal process to get past that. And then the other part was, let me find it. Um, you can Sorry, Michelle, what was the question again?
Oh, you're good. So just for those who perhaps worry that they don't feel like they have something to say, or maybe they're afraid perhaps that what they say doesn't necessarily have like weight to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So use your experience. So you want that personal touch. You're not just like one of the masses, right? You having that personality to it can really, really draw people in and make it more powerful, like climate change directly impacts me. So what I like to see, what I like to do is say as a young person or as a college student, and I know Chris in a lot of his letters writes wanting to leave a better world for his grandparents or leaving the world like better than he found it, and that really adds that very human aspect to these letters that like draws the readers in. And so with this group, what I'm very excited about is you all have experience with solar. So you can talk about those experiences in this industry on a way that maybe other people would not. And also you could draw in that maybe more moderate or right of center that finds solar more appealing in the same way that I may not be able to. Chris, I'll pass it to you.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you're very the presence on this Zoom indicates that you do have something to say. There is something that you're passionate about. Um, you may want to talk about uh, solar in terms of climate change, or you may simply want to say, you know, I didn't think this was a big thing, but I put solar panels on my roof 10 years ago, and I have saved $20,000. You know, so it what you say really depends on what is in your heart, and if you look in your heart, you'll find something.
I also, having talked with Chris in a previous conversation, something I want to share that he had said too was, if you're thinking about it, it's a good time to write it. And I thought that was really, really quite sage on Chris's part. And yeah, if you're pondering and reflecting on it, put it on paper. So for those who are going about that letter writing process, what strategies do you use to develop strong and compelling arguments for your letter? And Chris, maybe we can start with you on this one
Yeah,
again. And
I'll give two brief ideas. One is keep it short and focused, um, because you do not have enough word count to digress. And you usually don't even have enough word count that you can say, um, let's talk for a minute about a related topic. You usually don't have enough words, but also look for the middle. Try to make arguments that would appeal to 70, 80% of the readers. Um, don't look for something that appeals to the 10%, but might lose you support from the 70 or 80%. You're not going to change everybody's mind, but you often can change minds in the middle. Um, you're not likely to change the mind of someone who doesn't even think climate change is real. So you don't need to argue that point. Go for the middle.
Helen, do you want to add to that?
I think Chris handled.
Okay. Yeah, no, wonderful. Just wanted to make sure. Um, I guess then our next question would be, how do you find a good balance between personal opinion and factual information in your letters?
That's an interesting question, and I would probably say um, each letter you write can be different. You could write a letter that's almost entirely based on personal experience. And then you could also, in a different situation, you could write a letter that's 80% fact and 20% personal experience. So I always say don't ever hesitate to be yourself. Don't hesitate to speak from the heart. Um, but you can one day the perfect letter, or what you think of as the perfect letter, can be 70 words. and another time you may think about it and look it over and say, I think I need 300 words for this one, and 300 words is their word count, so I'm going to do it. So I guess you can find a balance, hopefully, and you can also get a first reader before you submit it if you're having trouble with it.
Yeah. I want to jump off of that and say, like, just be really careful to not accidentally spread misinformation. And so just be very clear, like, these are my personal experiences, or I believe that, versus like when you do cite something, make that clear as well. And exactly what you said in the presentation about like not repeating false information, because 6 months later, all they'll remember is that you mentioned something and forget the not part. So that's exactly right.
Thank you, Helen and Chris. Another question. I think we might have time for one more for the two of you before we go into our Q&A with the audience. And so the one that I really want to make sure we cover is, so Helen actually has a great example to show us, but I'm talking a little bit about how social media can play a role. Understanding that, right, not everyone may want to, but for those who do want to leverage that component or figure out how to integrate that in and continue to amplify it. Could you talk to, how have you used social media in the past for LTE?
Yeah, absolutely. So first I would say is you can we're with Citizens Climate Lobby, and so a big part of what we do is interacting with our members of Congress. And so when your representative does a search, their staffers do a search, your LTE, if you mention your representative, will appear in that with that direct connection to climate change, and they'll know that is something that the constituents and whatnot are interested in. And so you can use this by, again, putting your representative where relevant in the letter, but you can also, if your letter is published, tag them on social media. So I believe 80% of in the House have Instagram, and then an even larger portion have Twitter. So definitely use that to your advantage, and get your friends to like a retweet and along those lines as well. Another thing that my campus club at William and Mary has done, when Chris was so kind and drove all the way to William and Mary to help lead a similar workshop with us, is we went through the whole writing process and posted that online too, to help others get involved there as well. And so I have we've recorded a Instagram reel, and I am putting that in the chat now for your own use. And it went viral, which none of us were necessarily expecting. But looking back, it is such a fun video. But last time I checked, I believe it has like over 100,000 views. It really just like blew up the next day. So you never know. So not only are you getting that audience from the LTE itself, but you can perpetuate that by using social media as that platform as well. It's very powerful.
Thanks, Helen. And I wanted to be specific about what you were discussing with putting the name of a legislator in. So let's say you're writing an LTE on a state level bill for net metering. And in your LTE, you can say, I would love to see my delegate, Brad Smith, and my state senator, Bill Johnson, join the sponsors for this bill. And then those two legislators are going to see that you called them out by name. Also, your readers will say, oh, hey, why don't I call my delegate and my state senator to make that same ask? So you can leverage it, and the editors are not going to mind you doing that. And the last thing I wanted to mention is, if you get really ambitious, you can get into another mode of writing for a newspaper, which is called an op-ed. The nice thing about an op-ed is you can say exactly what you want to say, and you don't have to reference anything that appeared in the publication. You are a guest writer, you are a guest columnist, but it's more work. Okay, it's definitely more work. It's usually 650 to 700 words, and you usually have to go through several rewrites before it's right. But just in case you get really ambitious.
Thank you, Chris and Helen. And yeah, and so that's something too is, maybe that's the next step. Maybe you start out with LTEs and sometime you want to do an op-ed as well. Lots of paths for the future. But overall, thank you so much, Helen and Chris, for giving all of this great insight. I want to make sure we are able to open up some questions from our audience. So I'm going to start. I see one we have from Sarah. She says, I see, so the ask doesn't need to be a clear ask to a specific individual / group. It can be a generic call to action / show of support. Which is more effective? Should we include a link to take action or a specific action one can take, like calling a representative if one is available?
Definitely calling a representative is a great ask. That's very specific. There's no confusion on what you're asking. You can be a little bit more generic. You can also say things like, remember solar power when you go into the voting booth this year. You're not saying specifically, vote for this guy, don't vote for that. You're saying, keep this in your head, because sometimes people go into the voting booth and they act like solar power doesn't matter. Well, don't do that. Remember that it matters. So you can be generic or you can be specific. I would say don't be super vague. Get a little bit down into the trenches.
Thank you, Chris. Sarah, I hope that answered your question. And no, thank you. Hey, questions with context, like if that's needed, thank you for asking that. I see we have a general question about class writing proposals. Perhaps in the future, hope you never know. But okay, so Andrew's thinking about Project 2025 and the impact on the solar industry, and says affordability needs to be addressed. I guess kind of just, I think, yeah, so some thoughts there on pulling in different issues. I guess in terms of that, maybe that has to do a little bit with when you guys were saying like stay focused on your issues and just being tight. I don't know if you guys want to talk about that a bit more for clarification.
Well, I guess I could say, to begin with, Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonpartisan group, so we don't endorse a candidate, and we try not to, I guess, criticize one party over the other. Having said that, there are ways that you can say things like this. You can say, I have read the Project 2025 document, and I don't see anything that's positive about solar power in that. And I would like us to move to a world in which we compete for the best ways to grow renewable energy, rather than, fighting over getting it going or stopping it. I think that it's best to be as polite as you can be. But honestly, no, Project 2025 is not very helpful for renewable energy.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so we have two more questions. I'm going to read off the one. Okay, some of us can't put solar panels on our homes, shade, access, renting affordability, and need community solar, which is still not allowed in Pennsylvania. final push for a bill is happening this fall. We have about a week in September to get this over the finish line. So no articles in the local newspaper so far, but I'm hoping to send an LTE to urge my state senator to support. It already passed in the House. Ideas? I subscribe to a community solar project in Maryland, but alas, it's not allowed here.
I can actually take that one. So we are actively working towards getting community solar in Pennsylvania with our Pennsylvania program. So I would definitely encourage you, Elizabeth, if you haven't connected with our Pennsylvania team, to do so. Morgan, who's our community impact specialist there, is working with our state director, Monica, and our program assistant, Rachel, there to activate volunteers to do exactly this. So they are fully aware of the situation and want to make sure that it changes. So I will make sure that you're connected to them as well. But definitely submitting a letter is super helpful, even though there haven't been articles, and maybe it's the opportunity for an op-ed, like Chris said, a little bit longer of a submission, especially since you can relate to the benefits of community solar having subscribed in Maryland. That's I think a really powerful story to help people understand what community solar could do in Pennsylvania and how it can transform the state, which is really key. So I will make sure that you get the contact information for our Pennsylvania team.
Thank you, Annie. All right, we have a question asking, what is the LTE process the editors use to pick? What should we do to enhance probability of being published?
Well, let's see. If you put yourself in the mind of the editor, one thing they're looking for is timeliness. They don't want something that's a week old, because then the readers won't remember what you're referring to. They're looking for good writing that is focused. And I think they're looking for something that that has an emotional punch. I think that means something to an editor, because it improves your experience as a reader, or it engages you more as a reader, I should say, right? People respond to emotion with emotion on their own part. So I think those are the sort of things that an editor is looking for. I think it always helps if you are a young person too. One of the realities of the newspaper business is that most of the readers are my age, and they want to be relevant to younger readers. So, if you mention that you're a high school student or a college student, that's going to be worth a couple points for you.
Thank you, Chris. All right, and you see Annie is answering one more question in the chat. Thank you, Annie. And yeah, I just want to say that, Solar United Neighbors website does have a lot of wonderful information to peruse about different states and different initiatives going on solar specifically. So definitely go through our resources if you want some more information on different initiatives in different states there under our Take Action area. And yeah, Annie, is there anything else that oh, Helen, yes.
Yes. One last thing, if you are wanting maybe a bit more guidance or some community support, I do have I put some helpful links in the chat of CCL's resources. So you do not have to join CCL, but basically this summarizes a lot of what we talked about today. And then it also links to CCL's action writing team. They meet once a month. Everybody gets on Zoom. They greet each other, then immediately turn their cameras off for an hour, and then they come back and share what they've done. So it's a good motivator that way. And then also, I get to see Chris in my inbox a couple times a week, always working on helping others with their LTEs or writing some himself. So if you want that feedback that we're talking about, I absolutely recommend. And also the other thing with that is there, if you're looking for things to write, people will send uh, articles in saying, I don't have enough time to respond to this right now, but I don't want this to go unnoticed. So if anybody wants to write it, so definitely wonderful, wonderful place, wonderful community there.
Those are great resources. Thank you, Helen. I'll just share my screen again quickly just to go through the last couple of slides, although I think it's going to make it so it goes from the beginning, of course, because that's how the world works. Let's see. Can I go to the end? Nope, I'm just gonna have to go really quickly through it. Sorry. There we go. You know, Zoom, it just likes to be a little bit of a pain. So just in addition to the resources that Helen shared, and I would definitely encourage you to check them out. They're amazing. You can go to our Take Action page on solarunitedneighbors.org to learn about the issues that are affecting solar in your area if you'd like to write something in response to something that's going on in your neck of the woods. And then you can check out your local and regional papers, solar papers, that's a typo. Check out your local and regional papers for anything related to solar that's going on. It's worth a skim. Or even setting a Google alert. That's one of the ways that we keep tabs on solar related news is setting up a Google alert. So you get that in your inbox and you don't have to comb through them yourselves. And then draft a letter. It's a lot easier. It's also impossible to edit a blank page. So by just getting started, you've already made huge strides in getting a letter submitted and getting a letter published. All right. And then Michelle, do you want to share any last thoughts before we close?
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie. I just want to thank both Annie and our panelists again for being here and sharing the information. And I want to thank all of you guys for being here tonight, being curious, being open, and willing to try and make our world a better place. If you have any questions afterwards at that Get Involved email, please feel free to send questions our way. If you have questions for our panelists, Annie and I can get those questions to them. So thank you so much and best of luck, everyone. We can't wait to see your letters or hear about the letters that you've been writing. And yes, there will be a recording of this session.
Yes, we'll send the recording as well as the slide deck out within the next couple of days. So you'll get that in your inbox since you signed up. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.